Hello everyone, VD15 here, and welcome back to my game development series. I realise it's been a while, right? But give me a break, okay? Hentai Haven came back online, I've been a busy boy. In the last episode we made a window, decided on a graphics API to draw to it, and set out to write a basic renderer. 50 days later we have a square that we can rotate with the keyboard.
Did someone say Game of the Year?
I realise it's not very impressive, but a surprising amount of work went into this. I had to program keyboard input, an update loop, the renderer itself, and the square. Let's start with keyboard input. Since GLFW, the library I'm using to create the game window, defines certain callback functions for various keyboard-related events, you can receive keyboard input by listening to these callbacks and executing appropriate code. In an attempt to loosen the dependency between GLFW and the rest of my code, I'm containing all of GLFW's capabilities inside of the window module, stripping out everything that is specific to GLFW and exposing what's left to the rest of the application. For an example, GLFW has its own code to get what keyboard keys are currently down. If you were to call this GLFW specific function from everywhere that you needed to see where keys are down, that would make large swaths of your code very dependent on GLFW. Now, say something came up in development one day and for whatever reason you had to stop using GLFW. Maybe there's a problem with the library or you're moving to a platform that it doesn't support. That's now a lot of code that needs to be reworked in order to account for this. This can be avoided by wrapping any library-dependent functions in a proxy and then calling the proxy function instead. That way, if you need to swap out a library, all you need to do is rework what's on the other side of the proxy, and the rest of your code can continue to function as normal. I'm implementing this just about anywhere that I may need to rework some internals around at some point. For now, this is the keyboard, window, and renderer. As long as everything goes to plan, I shouldn't actually need to change anything anywhere, but if worse comes to worse, then the impact this has on development will hopefully be mitigated. Let's move on to the update loop. The update loop is programmable, to an extent, and by that I mean that you can add functions to the loop, but you can't take them out and you can't touch the thing while it's moving, or the whole thing will derail like a train in China. The intent of this is so developers can push their own systems to the game loop without too much of a hassle. I have bigger plans for this, which I'll get into a bit later. Now onto the square and the renderer, but before we do, I have deceived you, for the square exists only within the renderer. It's hard-coded into the thing along with the code that controls its movement. Now, while you could do the entire game like this, I have a bit too much rope on hand to see that particular route through to the end, so we're going to need to come up with a different solution. And it was at this point that I realized that I had put no thought into how I'm going to structure the actual game logic part of my engine. I've had some time to think about it since. I did some reading and I came across a paradigm called an entity component system that I'm quite eager to try out. In an entity component system, game logic is divided up into entities, components, and systems. Entities don't, strictly speaking, exist by themselves, rather they are defined by the components that make them up. Each of these components relate to a specific attribute or behavior of the entity. If you've ever used Unity before, you'll be familiar with this. For example, a basic cube object would consist of a transform component to define its position, a mesh to define its shape, a material to define what it looks like, and this can be extended to any other behavior that you define. But components don't have any behavior by themselves, rather that's where systems come in. Systems act by themselves and manipulate any entity that possesses a particular component. For example, a collision component may manipulate an entity with a collider component when said collider hits something. And this is where my programmable game loop comes back in. It will allow developers to make their own systems and push them to the game loop in whatever order they want. And since these systems won't usually affect the behavior of one another, I will imagine that this will result in some very clean and expandable code. So that's the gist of an entity component system. Now, how are we going to take our rotating square program and make it fit this paradigm? We'll need an entity for the square, components to store the square's position, rotation, size, and color. We'll also need systems to rotate and draw the square. A transform component can store the position, size, and rotation of the square, and we can have a draw primitive component visible to the renderer that tells it how and where to draw the square. We'll need some underlying code to support creating, storing, and deleting components and entities of various types all in one place, and we might even want some memory management to go with that. Once this has been accomplished, we'll need to work towards the minimum viable product for the game. To recap, the minimum viable product for the game will consist of a player, an enemy, a projectile, a tower, an enemy spawner, and a base to protect. To accomplish this, the renderer will need to be able to render multiple textures at once. We'll need to be able to take mouse input, we'll need to have systems to move the players, the enemies, the projectiles, we'll need systems to allow towers to target enemies, and we'll need a system to detect collision, not only between the enemies and projectiles, but also between the enemy and the base. We'll need a system to control the win-loss condition and the overall game state, and a load of components and entities to go along with it. Now, this is already getting really complicated, and there are a lot of things that I haven't even touched on yet. I'm going to need to make textures, figure out a nice way of importing files, figure out how to do audio as well. It's going to be a challenge, but I'm up for it. For the next episode, however, I just want to focus on getting the square to fit nicely within the entity component system that I've outlined, and obviously I'll need to actually make the entity component system. I'm finished with my university exams now and I'm back home for the summer, which means that I should have a lot more time to dedicate to the game and to this channel. I'm going to see if I can get these videos out a bit more regularly, because I admit that my current track record when it comes to uploads is not very good. I want to see if I can get these out about once a week, and if not, then I'll just continue with my current schedule of once every 2 weeks, and occasionally every 50 days. Now, with all that said, if you want to keep up to date with the development of my game, be sure to subscribe to this channel. I'm going to be posting regular update videos where I talk about where development is and the direction it's heading in. If you'd like to follow me outside of YouTube, then I have a Discord server linked in the description where you can talk to me directly. Other than that, I'm VD15, and I'll see you next time.